Hello everyone, and welcome to this video going through chapter 7 and 8 of Frankenstein and looking at some of the key quotations. It's quite an interesting couple of chapters here. So we've just read at the end of chapter 6, we've read Victor, kind of recovering after the creation of the creature and his initial feelings of negativity, and he's bounding along with a feeling of unbridled joy and hilarity. And Shelley uses dramatic tension to great effect here, because as Victor is most kind of highest, his feelings of joy and hilarity, chapter 7 starts with a letter from his father, and this letter reveals that William is dead, that sweet child whose smiles delighted and warmed my heart, who was so gentle yet so gay. Victor, he is murdered. So this kind of brings Victor back down to earth, really, and it's a kind of a real marking dramatic tension and change of mood of the novel, and certainly from chapter 6, and Victor kind of, if you like, picking himself back up after the creation of the creature. So this letter obviously details what happened, quite factual from Alphonse to his son, and it also details Elizabeth's response. Elizabeth fainted and was restored with extreme difficulty, which is obviously seen as stereotypically feminine behaviour. It's the exact same thing that happens to Victor Frankenstein after creating the creature. This idea that Victor behaves in a stereotypically feminine manner. He fainted and was restored with extreme difficulty by Clerval. So that gets the note, and then it's interesting that Clerval responds at the bottom of page 57 here. My dear Frankenstein, are you always to be unhappy? And this idea that although it's kind of a perhaps hyperbolic quote, a bit over the top from Henry here, this exclamation, it's actually true of Victor's life, because from this moment forward he is destined to be unhappy, as one by one his family are systematically killed, either by the creature or by kind of circumstance as well. And chapter 7 continues there with Victor wanting to go back home as quickly as possible, and there's the journey. This is quite an interesting section you could get in the exam, to look at how setting is used. It's also quite interesting to talk about how the romantic movement with a capital R is presented in the novel as well. I know you've done this in lessons. This idea of how nature and natural imagery is used to represent emotion, and to kind of how the two are interlinked with characters. It's definitely used in Frankenstein by Mary Shelley here. Victor mentions his journey is very melancholy as well, so straight away you've got his emotions there, which kind of projected onto and mirrored in nature as well. You've got the black sides of Jura and the bright summit of Mont Blanc. This idea of even the mountains here are this idea kind of contrasting there. You've got the black sides of Jura and the bright summit of Mont Blanc, this idea of brightness and hope, and the kind of the black and dark intimidating mountains. The response they produce in Victor is that he wept like a child. The simile here reflecting obviously him returning home. William has been murdered, the child there as well. And this idea that the romantic detail used by Shelley has such an impact. This idea of the dark and intimidating force of nature, and also the bright possibilities, and how Victor has been experimenting with these, and it's starting to lead to his downfall. And Victor kind of starts with this exclamation to his home: "Dear mountains, my own beautiful lake, how do you welcome your wanderer? Your summits are clear, the sky and lake are blue and placid. Is this to prognosticate peace, or to mock at my unhappiness?" And it's quite interesting, your summits are clear, the sky and lake are blue and placid. So this is a perfectly clear, peaceful scene of nature. And this idea of Victor is kind of wondering whether it's kind of causing peace there or mocking him. There's no kind of motion, there's no kind of there's nothing to kind of potentially reinvigorate Victor here. So it's like nature is kind of turned on him as well. Yeah, as I drew nearer home, grief and fear again overcame me. And this idea that he's kind of night closed around, and I can hardly see the dark mountains. The darkness brings this sense of fear and misery to him. And then the darkness is kind of interrupted by lightning and a storm, and the darkness and the storm, the thunder bursts with a terrific crash. And this idea of the thunderstorm representing the arrival of the creature very, very soon on the next page. And we've also got this idea of the thunderstorm representing Victor's state, the thunderstorm and lightning, of course, which led Victor to first develop his interest and passion for science as well. So all these things are kind of, is nature mocking him here with the thunder and lightning storm? is this a detail by Shelley? Actually, we've given you this kind of placid nature, and now this storm mocks you because it is the one thing you wanted to use to harness to create life, and now here we are. Or is it kind of foreshadowing the arrival of the creature? Nature plays a lot of different kind of roles in this journey that Victor's making. And then I perceived in the gloom a figure which stole from behind a clump of trees near me. So we're on page 60. A flash of lightning illuminated the object and discovered its shape plainly to me. Its gigantic stature and the deformity of its aspect, more hideous than belongs to humanity, instantly informed me that it was the wretch, the filthy demon to whom I had given life. So of course the creature is illuminated by the thunderstorm. So as he was, I suppose, originally illuminated by Victor's interest in thunder, which led to him getting life, he's now illuminated by the thunderstorm physically here, and he's described as a wretch, a filthy demon. Victor's response to his creation, to whom I'd given life as well. The deformity of its aspects, more hideous than belongs to humanity. So this idea that it's the creature's appearance that is hideous to Victor, particularly in that you can imagine in that almost horrific kind of illumination by brief lightning flashes, but also the wretch, the filthy demon here. We're not meaning filthy in terms of being filthy dirty, we're meaning filthy in terms of the creature's attitude. And also this is Victor's labelling the creature through his first person narrative here. We get this sense of his judgment of the creature, and obviously we've just seen William and we know who the murderer is. We can guess who the murderer is before we get there, but it's quite interesting the sense of judgment that Victor attacks his creature straight away. And he was the murderer as well. Victor realises what we realised a lot earlier on here. The italicised he there as well. And it's quite interesting that we contrast what happens in chapter 7 with this he was the murderer. And of course, yes, the creature physically murders William, but is the creature the murderer? Is the creature truly responsible for those murders? Is an absolutely massive point of debate, a good point for context and wider ideas. The extent to which can the creature's treatment as a filthy demon and a wretch excuse what he does in the novel? And this is also interesting when it comes to Justine's murder in the next chapter that we'll consider later on in this video, because actually while on page 60 Victor is talking about the creature being the murderer, Victor actually does seem to take an element of responsibility later on. I paused, and so Victor gets home, and he realised, and the first thought was to discover what I knew of the murderer and cause instant pursuit to be made. So Victor acknowledges that, he knows, he's seen the creature, and the creature is responsible for William's murder, and this has kind of crossed Victor's mind. But I paused when I reflected on the story that I had to tell, and the story would give an air of delirium to a tale otherwise so utterly improbable. So Victor tells nobody about what has happened, and his rationale for this is mad. The story is so improbable that people would think he was mad. And I think there's a question to be asked there: as would people think that? Obviously, as a modern reader, we would perhaps think, he's gone a bit mad. There's an element of delirium. It's completely improbable. But Victor stays quiet here, and him staying quiet leads to the death of further people. It leads to the death of Justine and potentially other deaths as well there. And is Victor's staying quiet because he's worried that people will think it's improbable, or is it because his hamartia, he doesn't want to take responsibility for what he's done? And that's the theme that's kind of further emphasised in the later chapter. So just because it says Victor thinks people would think he was mad if he told them that he was actually responsible, doesn't necessarily mean that is the case. It could be him trying to avoid responsibility altogether. And then I was firmly convinced in my own mind that Justine, and indeed every human being, was guiltless of this murder. So this idea that every human being, the creature not being a human, being a kind of something else, was guiltless of this murder, and he probably includes himself in there as well. They say that nobody's responsible. But also Victor's convinced about this because his dad has just said, I hope she'll be acquitted. And Victor's kind of putting his faith in human nature to acquit Justine of the murder Justine has been kind of tried. She's got the locket round her neck, if you remember, which is pretty damning evidence, but there obviously are quite a lot of inadequacies in the story, which is why they don't fully believe that Justine is guilty. And Victor kind of, and Alphonse is kind of restored as well. Dearest niece, dry your tears. If she is, you believe, innocent, rely on the justice of our laws and the activity which shall prevent the slightest shadow of partiality. And this idea that law and faith in humanity have been completely destroyed by Victor's actions, and for other reasons as well, which we'll get onto when we look at chapter 8. So chapter 7 ends with this idea of them believing that Justine is going to be acquitted. And of course, we're dealing at a time before forensic science. The evidence is pretty damning for Justine because she's got the locket and she's had the locket planted on her, and we know the creature does that as well. But the evidence is pretty damning there. She's going to go to a court where people aren't interested. We haven't got fingerprint technology. We're not really interested in the kind of, perhaps the size of Justine's fingers compared to the creature's fingers used to kill William would be very different. It's just a case of the woman's got the locket and she must be guilty. And there's this, again, further arrogance, perhaps ignorance, dramatic tension as the Frankensteins gradually console each other to the fact that no, they're going to be okay. And of course in chapter 8 they're really not. And Victor goes to the trial, and during the whole of this wretched mockery of justice I suffered living torture. And of course it is a mockery of justice, but Victor himself has made a wretched mockery of justice by creating the creature and completely subverting and destroying the order of nature as well and planet life. So this mockery of justice is perhaps a mockery of him as well, of there's kind of justice there as well, and he has his part to play in that mockery of justice because he never confesses to his crime. And he goes so far as to say, 1,000 times rather would I have confessed myself guilty of the crime ascribed to Justine, but I was absent when it was committed, and such a declaration would have been considered as the ravings of a madman. And again, it's very similar to the quotation we have seen on page 60 and 61, this idea that Victor, people would think I was mad. But surely, if people thought Victor was mad and judged him, at least him having said something, he would probably have been tried. He'd probably have been convicted as Justine was as well. So there's a question, Shelley makes him an unreliable first-person narrator here. We get this sense of heightened tension where actually, do we believe Victor here? And I would argue, Shelley wants us to kind of, look at this as somebody who is not taking responsibility for their actions. Victor's chief hamartia, he never takes responsibility. And also this is kind of, this is Victor retelling his story as well. So this is present day Victor reflecting on the past, and perhaps this is something that's been added in by Victor while he's telling the story to try and appease his conscience and make him feel better. And then of course Justine is tried. The court proceedings are here. Elizabeth gives a kind of a judge of character as well. Justine acknowledges that the evidence is against her as well. Several witnesses are called, they're character witnesses, but fear and hatred of the crime of which they supposed her guilty rendered them timorous. So this idea that people are afraid to speak up for Justine. And it could well partly be that as well. There's an element of class potentially there as well. You've got Justine isn't from, the kind of the same kind of wealth of the Frankensteins, for instance, or Elizabeth, or people who she'll work with in the past as well. Her family fell on hard times. It's been mentioned earlier on in the novel. So there's that class kind of imbalance there as well. And Elizabeth gives a character reference, and rather than having the desired effect, it's another example of a Frankenstein interfering and this being kind of not received well, because on whom the public indignation was turned with renewed violence. So Elizabeth gives her speech about how much she values Justine, and this does nothing but stoke up the crowd against her, charging her with the blackest ingratitude as well. And this idea then that even Justine is described as the most amiable, benevolent of human creatures. So Elizabeth speaks honestly, but perhaps because she is a woman at the time speaking about another woman, perhaps because of the nature of the crime and the murder of a child mentioned here, the fear and hatred of the crime, not Justine herself, but the murder of a child being so against the standards of decency, is seen, this idea of Elizabeth trying to defend her just does not go down well, and could be argued because it's a woman at the time trying to defend another woman in a patriarchal society, and there's that kind of commentary working there as well. And then by the time this has happened, could the demon who had murdered my brother and also in his hellish sport betrayed the innocent to death and ignominy, which this idea that actually, yes, the creature does this, but is Victor not the one betraying them as well, because he is just standing there watching Justine, his childhood friend, be sentenced to death and then executed. He should speak up really here as well, and he kind of rushed out of the court in agony, and his agony is nothing compared to the agony of Justine, who has been wrongly convicted of a crime that she did not commit. And Justine confesses her guilt, which might sound a bit strange to you, but to be honest, it wouldn't have been that strange. There are quite often people who will confess to a crime for a more lenient sentence if it's looking like the evidence is against them, as it does in Justine's case. Justine obviously should be sentenced to death, but for Justine as a religious woman, this idea that she does confess to the crime because the evidence is against, but this idea being executed, but this idea that I might obtain absolution. It's interesting that Justine confesses even though she knows that she is going to be executed as a result of confessing. She would have been executed anyway, they would have found her guilty, but she confesses that I might obtain absolution from God. So Justine confesses because she takes the consequences of what's happening, and she wants absolution from God. She wants to be pardoned by God and set free. She knows she didn't do it, she confessed a lie. And it's interesting that Justine talks about this in a way that she takes responsibility for something she didn't do, and she's talking to this while Victor is here. Victor, who gnashed his teeth and ground them together, uttering a groan that came from my innermost soul, at the bottom of page 68. Victor sounds like an animal here, and Victor's the one who doesn't take any responsibility at all. If Victor had confessed to what he'd done, he might obtain absolution, but he never confesses. And it's argued by the end of the novel that Victor, having rejected God, having played God and taken God's place, is now kind of refusing to confess and obtain absolution, refusing to try and save Justine. And Victor acknowledged himself here as the true murderer on page 69, and this also was my doing. So this idea of this could be Victor starting to take some responsibility, which is interesting because he was the murderer, as been repeated earlier on in chapter 7, but now we've got Victor I, the true murderer, acknowledging that he has had a part to play in this, and he is the true murderer. He is the one who creates and rejects the creature, and his rejection leads to the death of William and now Justine as well, and it is his doing. But none of these declarations are public. This is all in his first person narrative, his unreliable first person narrative. So we see through Victor here this sense of this sense of acceptance that he has done something wrong, but is this the work of self-pity, or someone who takes responsibility? And I'd argue it is more self-pity here as well, because again there's no, Shelley has him not publicly confess the crime, and through his narration we can see his guilt here, but we can also, when we meet the creature later on and Victor meets the creature, we can see how Victor is very, very quick to judge the creature for those murders, and rightly so as well. The creature does commit murder, but completely absolve himself of blame in a way that in chapter 8 he does actually start to take some responsibility there. And he acknowledges William and Justine as the first hapless victims to my unhallowed arts. And it's quite a dark tone to the end of chapter 8 here, because they are the first victims, and of course there are going to be many, many more. Hapless, so completely helpless to what's happened to my unhallowed arts. And Victor's unhallowed arts and his refusal to confess and to seek absolution contrasts the innocence of Justine and William in chapter 8 and chapter 7 as well. So, like I say, make some notes on these key quotations. There's lots about Victor not taking responsibility in the narrative, but not taking public responsibility, and his inability to take that responsibility leads to the death of two innocent people as well. And I say make some notes on those key quotations, start to look at key words, And there's some good ideas and context here. This idea of to what extent is the creature guilty or Victor guilty for the crimes, and there's a lot of debate about that. It's not just a case of, you know, oh, the creature murdered them, so the creature's responsible. You need to consider Victor's role in this as well, and Shelley wants us to do that by what she's doing in chapter 7 and 8 here as well.